Welcome, dear listeners, to a journey through the heart of Renaissance Portugal, where destiny wove the most improbable threads into a tapestry of love and courage. Today, I tell you the story of Maria de los Dolores, a young orphan who, on a September morning in 1547, saw her life transformed forever when a royal bride mysteriously disappeared from the altar. Imagine for a moment, you are in the great hall of the royal palace of Lisbon, the smell of melted wax floating in the air, hundreds of candles flickering while ambassadors from all over Europe wait. But the bride doesn't appear. 30 minutes of sepulchral silence, and then a decision that would change not only a kingdom, but the destiny of a simple maid who learned to read hidden in the corridors of a convent. Before beginning this exciting journey, tell me in the comments, where are you watching us from? I love knowing that this story will reach hearts in different places of our Brazil and the world. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that, like that helps our community of lovers of good stories to grow. Year 1547, Lisbon, Kingdom of Portugal, Royal Palace of the House of Avis. The smell of melted wax permeated every stone of the great hall, transformed that September morning into an improvised chapel. Hundreds of candles trembled like terrestrial stars, their golden tears dripping over silver candelabras that reflected the morning light filtering through the stained glass windows. The thick air also carried the perfume of white roses and jasmine, intertwined in garlands that adorned the marble columns. Ambassadors from Florence adjusted their brocade vestments, while representatives from Toledo reviewed the gifts arranged on tables covered by embroidered silk fabrics. From distant Vienna, grey-bearded men observed with calculating eyes that union which would seal alliances beyond the seas. The Kingdom of Portugal, under the regency of Queen Mother D. Leonor de Avis, prepared to offer the world a spectacle of power and diplomacy. At the altar, Prince D. João de Avis waited, his navy blue coat, ornamented with golden embroidery that told stories of Lusitanian conquests, shone under the dancing light of the candles. The celestial band that crossed his chest bore the royal arms, and upon his chestnut hair rested a simple crown, but of pure gold. His eyes, of that golden olive color he had inherited from the Avis, fixed on the main entrance of the hall. 30 minutes had passed. The discreet murmur of the guests began to grow like the buzzing of restless bees. Archbishop D. Diogo, attired in ceremonial vestments embroidered with golden threads, held the prayer book with hands that began to tremble slightly. The Queen Mother, wrapped in her purple dress that whispered with every movement, maintained an impassive face, but her fingers drummed nervously on the arm of the royal chair. It was then that a page emerged, running through the marble corridors, his steps resonating like hammers on stone. He approached the Queen Mother with reverence, but the tremor in his voice betrayed the urgency of the message. "Your Majesty," he whispered, bowing so low that his lips almost touched the royal ear, "D. Isabel de Castro is not in her chambers." The entire hall seemed to have suspended its breath, although the words had been whispered. It was as if the very stones sensed that something fundamental had crumbled. In the bride's chambers, they discovered the wedding dress abandoned on the divan, like a skin someone had decided not to wear anymore. The ivory silk fabric, embroidered with silver threads that drew motifs of leaves and flowers, lay inert, still keeping the shape of the body that had worn it for few moments. The tiara of ancient pearls, inheritance of Portuguese queens, rested on the dressing table like a dethroned crown. At the window, the damask curtains swayed in the wind that entered freely, carrying with it the aroma of the royal gardens and perhaps the last sigh of a bride who had chosen freedom instead of duty. A letter had been left on the silk pillow, sealed with the Castro seal. When the Queen Mother opened it, its words fell upon the silence of the room like raindrops on dry earth. "I cannot live as a prisoner of duty, no matter how golden the prison may be. Forgive me, but I choose the unknown over the certainty of a life without soul." Destiny, in that instant, prepared to weave a new pattern in the tapestry of history, and in the convent of Our Lady of Mercy, a young maid named Maria de los Dolores folded sheets in the laundry, without imagining that her life was about to be rewritten by the hands of necessity and chance. Maria de los Dolores pressed the hot iron against the white linen, steam rising like morning incense, while she observed through the small window of the laundry the towers of the royal palace outlined against the September sky. Her hands, calloused by years of hard work, moved with the precision of one who had learned from a very young age that perfection was the only accepted coin for survival. At 19 years old, she carried on her shoulders the memory of a brutally interrupted childhood. At 8 years old, when her father, a ruined merchant from Braga, delivered her to the nuns of Our Lady of Mercy to settle debts that consumed him like leprosy, Maria had learned that the world was a place where destinies were bought and sold like sacks of flour. In the convent, between morning prayers and laundry work, she had discovered that the human soul possessed secret corners where not even the most rigorous discipline could penetrate. Hidden behind the columns of the convent library, she had absorbed every word that the noble nuns read during the lessons of the more fortunate pupils. Her fingers had learned to dance over embroidered lines, secretly observing the most skilled sisters create silk flowers that seemed to breathe. That morning, however, something disturbed the sacred routine of the convent. Sister Caterina entered the laundry like a whirlwind of white habits and poorly disguised anxiety. "Maria," she said, her voice carrying an urgency that made the words stumble over each other, "you must come with me immediately." The iron slipped from Maria's hands, leaving a dark mark on the perfect linen. It was the first time in 11 years that someone called her with such haste. She followed the nun through the narrow corridors, her bare feet whispering over the cold stones, while her heart hammered questions for which there were no answers. In the main courtyard of the convent, a royal carriage waited. It wasn't just any carriage. The golden blazon of the Avis gleamed on the black wood like a sun in dark night. Liveried men remained beside the restless horses, their faces carved by the seriousness of a mission that transcended the common. "Her Majesty the Queen Mother requests your presence at the palace," announced the first coachman, his words sounding like a sentence whose nature still remained hidden. Maria de los Dolores felt the world tilt slightly, as if the earth had lost for an instant its ancestral firmness. In her simple and predictable life, queens were figures of legend, as distant as the stars she observed on sleepless nights when nostalgia for her dead parents prevented her from sleeping. The journey to the palace passed like a nebulous dream. Through the small windows of the carriage, Maria observed Lisbon unfold in stone streets, houses with colorful facades, and markets where the voices of vendors mixed in an urban symphony she knew only by hearsay. The aroma of grilled fish, fresh bread, and oriental spices invaded the carriage, painting the air with perfumes of a world that had always been denied to her. When the doors of the royal palace opened before her, Maria de los Dolores understood that she was no longer the same person who had awakened that morning to fold sheets. Destiny, capricious as always, had decided that an orphaned maid was about to be thrown into the center of a storm that would change not only her life, but the history of a kingdom. The pink marble columns rose like petrified trees, and the tiles that told stories of navigators and saints seemed to observe her with ceramic eyes. Her bare feet resonated on the mosaics, like heartbeats that didn't know whether they should accelerate from fear or expectation. Queen Mother de Leonor de Avis awaited her in the hall of audiences, and when her eyes met Maria's, a smile that didn't reach her lips slightly curved the corner of her mouth. "Come closer, child," she said, and her voice carried the authority of one who had been born to command destinies. "Today, the kingdom needs you in a way you never imagined." The dress of D. Isabel de Castro hung in the hands of Maria de los Dolores like a silk cloud that weighed more than lead. Each silver embroidery told a story she had never lived. Each fold whispered secrets of a world to which she didn't belong. The royal ladies who surrounded her moved like rehearsed dancers, adjusting, pulling, aligning, transforming the body of a maid into the silhouette of a royal bride. "Lift your chin," murmured one of them, while adjusting the pearl tiara over Maria's hair, which had been brushed until it shone like black silk. A princess never looks down, but Maria de los Dolores couldn't help it. She looked down because it was there, in the small details of the marble floor, where she found some relief for the vertigo that had taken her since the moment she understood what the Queen Mother expected of her. It wasn't just wearing a dress, it was wearing an entire life, an identity that had been imposed on her like a mask she didn't know when she could remove. The Queen Mother observed from her chair upholstered in purple velvet, her eyes studying every movement, like a general analyzing war strategies. "Perfect," she finally murmured, and Maria knew that that word sealed her destiny more definitively than any royal document. The procession that led her to the altar, transformed in the great hall, seemed to move through thick water. The faces of the guests blurred into a mass of expectation and curiosity, while the music of lutes and violas resonated like songs from another world. Maria felt like an actress who had entered the scene without knowing the script, hoping that each step wouldn't reveal the imposture she carried like a second skin. Prince D. João de Avis awaited her at the altar, his golden olive eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her shudder. There was something in that gaze that went beyond ceremonial formality, a search, as if trying to find something familiar in a face he knew was unknown. Archbishop D. Diogo raised his attired hands, and the Latin words of the ceremony began to flow like water over ancient stones. Maria understood only fragments, but felt the weight of each syllable like drops of melted lead on her conscience. When the moment came to respond, "I accept," her voice came out in a whisper that seemed to come from far away, like an echo of someone she used to be. The ring slid over her finger with a coldness that made her shudder. It was of worked gold with rose and thorn motifs, and when the metal touched her skin, Maria de los Dolores felt as if an invisible chain closed around her soul. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a golden prison from which she didn't know how to escape. The palace bells began to toll, announcing to the kingdom that the heir prince had found his consort. But in Maria's ears, that sound seemed like a funeral lament for a life that had just died. The orphaned maid who had awakened that morning to fold sheets in the convent had been buried under layers of silk and pearls, and in her place had been born a false princess who didn't even know how to be herself. When the ceremony ended, and the guests approached to present compliments, Maria smiled as she had observed noble ladies do, a smile that didn't reach the eyes, educated and distant like starlight. Her hands, still calloused from hard work, remained carefully hidden in the folds of the royal dress. The prince offered her his arm, and together they walked through the hall while white rose petals fell on them like perfumed snow. But Maria de los Dolores knew that this wasn't a celebration. It was the beginning of a performance that might last the rest of her life, and from which she didn't know if she would ever be able to remove the mask. In the chambers that were assigned to her, when she was finally alone, Maria looked at herself in the Venetian mirror framed in gold. The person who returned her gaze was a stranger dressed as a princess, with pearls at her neck and silk on her shoulders. But in her eyes still shone the soul of the orphaned maid who had learned to read in hiding, and who knew that, no matter how golden it was, a prison remained a prison. What she still didn't know was that someone else, in that same palace, also felt like a prisoner of a destiny he hadn't chosen. The nuptial chambers had been prepared with rose petals and virgin wax candles, but when Prince D. João de Avis closed the door behind him, the romantic perfume couldn't mask the tension that floated in the air like a storm cloud. Maria de los Dolores remained by the window, still wearing the wedding dress, but something in her posture, the way her shoulders curved slightly, the manner in which her hands intertwined, betrayed an origin that no royal silk could hide. "Turn around," he said, and his voice carried a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. It was the weariness of a man who had just understood he had been deceived before all of Christian Europe. When Maria turned, their eyes met in what would be the first moment of truth between them. There was no more ceremony mask, no more rehearsed smiles, only two human beings trapped in a net that others had woven for them. "You are not Isabel de Castro," said João, and it wasn't a question. It was an affirmation charged with a painful certainty he had tried to deny during the entire ceremony. Maria de los Dolores lowered her eyes, but something in her deep nature, perhaps that dignity that not even years of servitude had managed to crush, made her raise them again to meet the prince's gaze. "No, your highness, I am not." "Then who are you?" The question came out like a whisper, charged with a vulnerability that few had seen in Portugal's future king. "Maria de los Dolores, orphan from Braga, maid of the convent of Our Lady of Mercy." Each word was pronounced with the simplicity of one who had learned that truth, no matter how painful, was always more dignified than lies. "Her Majesty, the Queen Mother, ordered that I wear this dress and take D. Isabel's place. I had no choice." João walked to the table where a bottle of port wine waited, served a cup, and drank like one trying to drown a bitterness that grew like tide. Outside, the royal gardens whispered with the night wind, and the aroma of jasmine entered through the window, like a melancholic perfume. "And D. Isabel?" he asked, although part of him already knew the answer. "She fled, Your Highness. She left a letter." The silence that followed wasn't just absence of sound. It was a void pregnant with consequences that both were beginning to understand. The entire kingdom celebrated a royal marriage. Ambassadors from all over Europe had been witnesses, and everything was based on a lie as fragile as glass. João approached the window and observed the gardens where, in just a few hours, guests would celebrate with banquets and dances. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked, but his voice didn't carry anger. It carried a deep sadness, like that of a man who sees his dreams crumble like sandcastles. "I obeyed, Your Highness, as I always did." Maria de los Dolores didn't try to justify herself or apologize. There was a serenity in her acceptance that contrasted with the prince's inner agitation. "And now?" João turned toward her, and for the first time Maria saw not the heir prince of Portugal, but a 26-year-old man who felt as lost as she did. "What do we do now that we are husband and wife before God and men based on a lie?" Maria de los Dolores looked at the ring that weighed on her finger like an anchor. "I don't know, Your Highness. I never thought it would go this far when they brought me from the convent this morning." "This morning?" João repeated the words as if they were from another century. "This morning we were two different people, and now we are Prince and Princess of Portugal, united by a sacrament that neither one nor the other chose." Outside, the city bells began to toll 10 o'clock at night, and Maria de los Dolores understood that that sound marked not only the end of a day, but the end of an entire existence. The orphaned maid had died that morning, and in her place had been born a false princess who didn't know how to live the life that had been imposed on her. What she still didn't know was that sometimes lies carry within them seeds of truths that not even those who plant them can foresee. The room that was assigned to her in the east wing of the palace was small compared to the royal chambers, but for Maria de los Dolores it seemed like an entire universe. The walls covered by tapestries that told stories of ancient battles observed her movements with golden thread eyes, while the bed with blue damask canopies waited like a refuge where she could hide her confusion. 3 days had passed since the wedding, and the official version circulating through the marble corridors was that Isabel de Castro had suddenly fallen ill, and by medical recommendation, the ceremony had been performed intimately, only with the royal family and closest ambassadors. The bride, still weakened, rested in separate chambers until her health was completely restored. Maria had quickly learned that in the royal palace, truth was a malleable substance that was molded according to the kingdom's needs. The maids whispered different versions of the story in the corridors, some speaking of a shy bride, others of a mysterious ailment that had afflicted the young Castro. But none of them suspected that the true princess slept in a simple room in the east wing, embroidering to pass time as she had always done in the convent. Her fingers moved over the embroidery hoop with the same precision she had learned observing the most skilled nuns. The flowers she created in silk threads seemed to breathe on the white fabric. Red roses that carried all the passion she had never experienced, blue violets that whispered the nostalgia she felt for the simple days in the convent. Embroidering was her way of praying, of maintaining sanity in a life that had become a labyrinth without exit. During the mornings, she discreetly explored the palace dependencies. She had memorized the routes that led to the library, where leather-bound books kept stories of kings and queens who had also faced destinies they didn't choose. She knew the way to the minor chapel, where she had found a Bible abandoned on a carved wooden kneeler. In the yellowed pages, she searched for words that could give meaning to the storm her life had become. The inner garden, with its marble fountains and perfectly aligned cypresses, had become her favorite refuge. There, among statues of ancient gods and lavender beds, she could pretend for a few moments that she was still the orphaned maid who used to observe the world through the small windows of the convent. The perfume of flowers mixed with the sound of running water, creating a symphony that calmed her restless soul. It was on one of those mornings, while walking among the rose bushes that were beginning to give their last fruits before winter, that she found Prince D. João for the first time since the wedding night. He was sitting on a stone bench, observing a document he held with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. When he saw her, he raised his eyes, and Maria de los Dolores understood that he too carried the weight of that farce like an invisible cross. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep sadness and perhaps a beginning of curiosity about who that woman really was, whom destiny had put in his path. "Good morning, Your Highness," she said, slightly inclining her head as she had observed the court ladies do. "Good morning, Maria." The way he pronounced her name, not Princess, not Your Highness, but simply Maria, carried a hesitant intimacy, as if it were the first time he experienced calling her by what she really was. "I can withdraw if Your Highness wishes to be alone," she offered, but something in her voice suggested that she too felt strangely comfortable in that unexpected company. "No," said João, and after a pause he added, "I keep wondering what it's like for you, living that lie every day." Maria de los Dolores sat at the opposite end of the bench, maintaining the respectful distance her condition demanded, but allowing herself a proximity that was, at the same time, forbidden and inevitable. "It's not so different from before, Your Highness. I always lived the life that others chose for me." Her words carried an acceptance that wasn't resignation, but a form of wisdom that only those who had known true adversity could develop. And so it was in that garden perfumed by lavender and watered by the melancholy of two intertwined destinies that something began to be born that neither one nor the other knew how to name. It was fragile like the first light of morning, uncertain like the perfume of flowers that the wind carried and brought. But it was real, perhaps the only real thing in all that golden performance their lives had become. The first letter arrived on an October morning, when the chestnut leaves were beginning to turn golden, and the air carried that particular melancholy of autumn. Maria de los Dolores found it slipped under the door of her chambers, like a paper serpent that brought poison instead of ink. "Soon everyone will know that you are not who you pretend to be. A lie cannot sustain a crown." There was no signature, only a red wax seal with an engraved rose, a symbol she didn't recognize, but that made her feel as if invisible eyes observed her from the palace shadows. The words were written in feminine calligraphy, educated from someone who had learned to handle the pen with the same skill with which she handled intrigues. Maria folded the letter and kept it in a secret drawer of the dressing table, among the embroidered handkerchiefs she had brought from the convent. It wasn't fear she felt. It was a kind of bitter relief. Finally, someone had put into words the truth she carried like a stone in her chest. She was only an impostor in a court of real people. In the days that followed, she observed the faces around her with more attention. During meals in the smaller hall where she dined with the prince and the queen mother, she studied every expression, every movement of the eyes, looking for signs of who might know her secret. The court ladies moved like swans on a lake, their conversations punctuated by musical laughter and gazes that seemed to scrutinize her soul in search of flaws. It was during one of those dinners that she met Doña Filipa de Meneses, the prince's cousin, a 35-year-old woman whose grey eyes seemed capable of deciphering mysteries written in the stars. She always dressed in sober colors, deep purples, dark blues, as if permanent mourning for a world that didn't correspond to her expectations was her trademark. "Your Highness seems to have adapted so well to court life," commented Doña Filipa, her voice sweet like honey that hid a blade. "It's remarkable how some people manage to transform so completely." Maria de los Dolores felt the words like delicate pinpricks on her skin, but maintained her serene face as she had learned to do. "Adaptation is a necessary virtue in any change, Doña Filipa." "Oh, yes, especially when the changes are so dramatic." Doña Filipa's smile didn't reach her eyes, and Maria understood she had found the author of the anonymous letters. The second letter arrived a week later, this time bolder in its threats. "The people of Portugal deserve to know that their future queen is an impostor. How many more secrets will this kingdom keep in the name of convenience?" This time Maria didn't keep the letter in the secret drawer. Instead, she sought Prince D, João in his private chambers, where he used to study state documents until late hours of the night. The candlelight drew dancing shadows on his face when she knocked on the door and was invited to enter. "I need to show you something, Your Highness," she said, extending the letter with hands that didn't tremble. João read the words in silence, and Maria observed how a wrinkle of concern formed between his eyebrows. When he finished, he raised his eyes to her with an expression that mixed protection and determination. "Do you know who might have written this?" "I suspect Doña Filipa de Meneses, but I'm not certain." João placed the letter on the table, beside the documents he was studying. She always had very firm opinions about how the kingdom should be governed, and about who should govern it. "She is right, Your Highness," said Maria, and her voice carried a serenity that surprised them both. "I really am an impostor. If she decides to expose the truth—" "No," interrupted João, getting up and approaching her with an urgency that made Maria's heart accelerate. "You are my wife before God and men. That's what matters now." For the first time since the wedding, Maria de los Dolores felt something beyond resignation or fear. She felt a strange warmth spreading through her chest, as if a small son had been born there where before there had been only the coldness of fulfilled duty. "But the truth always comes to light, Your Highness," she whispered. "Then we'll face the truth when it comes," said João. And in pronouncing those words, both knew that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer just two people trapped in a farce. They were allies in a battle they still didn't know how to fight, but which they were willing to face together. The November morning brought with it not only the humid cold that made the royal gardens exhale ghostly vapors, but also a carriage that would forever change the delicate balances that Maria de los Dolores had learned to navigate in the palace. The blazon engraved on the sides of the carriage wasn't that of the Avis. It was the shield of the Castro, with their golden eagles and red roses that seemed to bleed on the polished metal. D. Isabel de Castro had returned. From the window of her chambers in the east wing, Maria observed the slender figure that descended from the carriage with the natural grace of one who had been born for that world of silks and reverences. Even dressed in a simple traveling outfit, Isabel possessed that innate elegance that no education could teach. It was as if each of her movements was choreographed by the invisible hands of ancestral nobility. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, and when she raised her face to observe the palace towers, Maria could see, even at a distance, those blue eyes that seemed to reflect the winter sky. She was beautiful in a way that transcended the merely physical. She was beautiful with the beauty of things that naturally belong to the place where they are. Queen Mother D. Leonor de Avi received her in the Hall of Audiences, but Maria knew from the maid's whispers that the encounter had been cold as the marble of the walls. Isabel was lodged in the west wing of the palace, as distant as possible from the royal chambers, in a suite that, although luxurious, carried the symbolic weight of exile. For 3 days, the palace vibrated with underground tensions. The court ladies divided into invisible factions. Some whispered that the true bride had finally returned to claim her place. Others murmured that a woman who abandons the altar loses forever the right to the throne. The servants moved through the corridors like actors who didn't know what play they were performing, serving two princesses who couldn't coexist. Maria de los Dolores withdrew even more to her chambers, going out only for obligatory meals and for her morning walks through the gardens. But even in the refuge of her rooms, she felt the weight of D. Isabel's presence like a storm approaching on the horizon. Inevitable, disturbing, charged with consequences she couldn't foresee. It was on an afternoon of fine drizzle, when Lisbon's sky seemed to cry silver tears, that the two met face to face for the first time. Maria was walking through the palace library, seeking refuge among the books that had become her only confidants, when she heard delicate steps resonating among the tall shelves. D. Isabel de Castro emerged from among the book shadows like an apparition dressed in celestial blue. She was smaller than Maria had imagined, more fragile, with a beauty that seemed made of porcelain and dreams. When their eyes met, the world seemed to suspend its breath. "You must be Maria de los Dolores," said D. Isabel, and her voice carried a melancholy that resonated in the high vaults of the library. There was no anger in her words, no accusation, only a deep sadness, like that of someone who looks at the fragments of a broken mirror that reflected her own image. "Your ladyship," responded Maria, inclining her head with the respect she had learned was due to nobility, but keeping her eyes raised with the dignity that was hers by right of soul's birth. "Don't look at me as if you were guilty," said D. Isabel, approaching with steps that whispered over the marble. "It wasn't you who chose this situation, just as I didn't choose to flee until I couldn't do anything else. Why did you return?" The question left Maria's lips before she could contain it, charged with a curiosity that went beyond simple courtesy. D. Isabel walked to one of the tall windows that faced the gardens, where rain created small temporary lakes among the rose bushes. because I discovered that freedom without love is just a larger prison, and because I understood that I had left behind not just a groom, but a responsibility that might be greater than my fears. The two women remained in silence for long minutes, observing the rain transform the exterior world into a watercolor painting. Each carried half of a destiny that should have been only one's, and both knew that that encounter marked the beginning of a battle where neither wanted to fight, but from which neither could flee. The Royal Council Hall had never housed a session so charged with invisible tensions. The carved oak chairs, occupied by the kingdom's most powerful men, seemed like isolated islands in a sea of political anxiety. Queen Mother D. Leonor de Avi presided over the table with her imposing presence, dressed in a purple outfit that absorbed the light from the tall windows as if it were made of the very essence of royal authority. To her right sat D. Afonso de Portugal, Count of Vimioso, a grey-bearded man whose small, calculating eyes had navigated decades of palace intrigues. To the left, Dom Antonio de Ataide, an experienced diplomat whose ink-stained hands revealed entire nights dedicated to correspondence with European courts. Archbishop Diogo completed the inner circle, his ecclesiastical vestments contrasting with the secular environment, but his political influence being as tangible as the stones that supported the palace. "The situation has become delicate," said the Queen Mother, her voice cutting the heavy air like a well-sharpened blade. D. Isabel de Castro's return brought questions we can no longer ignore. Dom Afonso cleared his throat, a sound that resonated through the hall's vaults like an omen. "Majesty, I fear the marriage's legitimacy might be questioned if there are doubts about the bride's identity." "There are no doubts about the bride's identity," interrupted a firm voice from the hall's entrance. Everyone turned to see Prince D. João de Avis entering with determined steps, wearing a dark blue velvet coat that enhanced the determination carved in his features. The ceremony was performed according to all the kingdom's traditions and laws. "Your Highness," said Dom Antonio de Ataide, his words carefully measured like ingredients of a delicate potion, "we understand your position, but the diplomatic implications—" "The diplomatic implications," said João, taking his place at the table with an authority that made some of the councillors involuntarily step back, "are that Portugal honors its commitments. The marriage was consummated before God, witnessed by the Archbishop and validated by representatives from Florence, Toledo, and Vienna." Archbishop D. Diogo raised his attired hands in a gesture of conciliation. "Highness, the Church recognizes the validity of any sacrament performed according to established rites. But the circumstances, said João, his voice gaining an intensity that made the candles tremble, were that a bride fled from her responsibilities and a substitute was found to avoid a diplomatic crisis. There was no deception on Maria de los Dolores' part. There was imposition, which she accepted out of obedience to the kingdom. The Queen Mother observed her son with eyes that tried to decipher the movements of his soul. There was something in the passionate defense João made of Maria de los Dolores that transcended mere political necessity. It was as if he were defending not just an arranged marriage, but something that had grown within him without his noticing. "And regarding D. Isabel de Castro's rights?" asked Dom Afonso, his voice charged with a political malice he had sharpened during decades of intrigues. "She returned claiming that her flight was a moment of weakness and that now she's prepared to fulfill her duties as Princess of Portugal." João stood up, and his movement was so sudden that the oak chair creaked on the floor stones. D. Isabel de Castro had her opportunity to be Princess of Portugal. She chose to flee. That choice had consequences that cannot be undone by convenience. But if she was frightened, if it was a moment of— "It was a choice," repeated João, and each word fell upon the hall's silence like hammer on anvil. "And choices define who we are. Maria de los Dolores didn't choose this situation, but she embraced it with dignity. D. Isabel chose to flee, and now she must live with the consequences of that choice." The silence that followed was pregnant with political implications. Every man at that table knew they were witnessing not just a discussion about royal marriages, but about the future character of the Portuguese monarchy. The heir prince was defending an orphaned maid against a noble of blood, and that would revolutionize the foundations on which the kingdom was sustained. The Queen Mother rose slowly, and her decision, when it came, was pronounced with the authority of one who had governed Portugal through crises that had tested the kingdom's very existence. The marriage remains valid. Maria de los Dolores will continue to be recognized as princess consort. D. Isabel de Castro will be treated with the courtesy due to her lineage, but not as a member of the royal family. She paused, her eyes sweeping each face at the table. This decision is final and will not be reviewed. But in the palace shadows, Doña Filipa de Meneses smiled her cold smile like a silver blade. The political battle had been lost, but she knew other forms of war, and some of them were even more effective than royal councils. The letter that arrived on a December morning wasn't anonymous like the previous ones. It bore the official seal of the Castro, that red rose engraved in wax that seemed to bleed on the parchment paper. Doña Filipa de Meneses delivered it personally to Maria de los Dolores, her grey eyes shining with a satisfaction she didn't even try to disguise. D. Isabel de Castro has requested public audience with the full council, she said, savouring each word as if it were rare wine. She intends to expose the entire truth about the marriage and about who you really are. Maria de los Dolores received the news with the same serenity with which she had received all the storms of her life. She folded the letter carefully and kept it between the pages of a prayer book she had found in the library. Thank you for informing me, Doña Filipa. Is that all you have to say? The prince's cousin seemed disappointed with the lack of drama in Maria's reaction. Do you understand that this could mean the end of all this? She gestured vaguely around the room, encompassing not only the luxurious chambers, but the entire life Maria had been forced to build. I understand, said Maria, going to the window where she observed the gardens covered by winter's first frost. The rose bushes were sleeping, their bare branches extending toward the sky like arms in supplication. But the truth was always there, Doña Filipa. It just chose a different moment to reveal itself. When Doña Filipa left, leaving behind only the rose perfume she used as a personal signature, Maria de los Dolores remained by the window for a long time. She knew that would be one of the last moments of peace she would have before the storm descended upon her life again. The public audience was scheduled for 3 days later, in the Marble Hall, the largest and most imposing of the palace. The news spread through the court like fire in dry straw, and Maria could feel the gazes that followed her through the corridors, some curious, others pitying, many simply eager for the approaching drama. On the night before the audience, Prince D. Joan came to her chambers. He entered without knocking. A privilege marriage gave him, but remained respectfully near the door, as if understanding that moment demanded delicacy. You can still refuse to appear, he said, his voice charged with a protection that surprised her. I can declare that you're indisposed. Maria de los Dolores was sitting at her dressing table, brushing her long hair that shone like black silk in the candlelight. In the mirror, her eyes met his, and for a moment both saw themselves not as prince and princess, but as two people who had learned to find comfort in each other's company. No, Your Highness. I've fled from the truth too long. She turned to face him directly. If D. Isabel wishes to expose who I really am, let her do it. I'm no longer afraid. And who are you really, Maria? The question left his lips charged with an intimacy that made her heart accelerate. I am an orphan from Braga who learned to read in hiding and who was transformed into a princess by political necessity, she said, her honesty cutting the air like crystal. But I'm also the woman who learned to love this kingdom, this life, and... The following words remained suspended between them, too heavy to be pronounced, but too clear to be ignored. Joan approached her, and for the first time since the marriage, he touched her face with fingers that trembled slightly. And I am the prince who discovered that love can be born from the most improbable circumstances. On the morning of the audience, Maria de los Dolores wore the simplest dress she possessed, a dark blue wool dress without gold embroidery or pearls that would mask her origin. She had gathered her hair in a simple braid as she used to do in the convent, and the only ornament she wore was the wedding ring she had become accustomed to feeling as part of herself. The marble hall was packed when she entered. Nobles from all over Portugal had come to witness what promised to be the trial of the century. D. Isabel de Castro was already present, dressed with an elegance that purposely contrasted with Maria's simplicity. Doña Filipa de Meneses occupied a prominent place, her eyes shining with anticipation. But it was Prince D. João's gaze that Maria sought and found, and in it she read not only support, but something that made her raise her chin with the dignity she had learned in Braga's difficult streets and in the convent's silent corridors. What she didn't know was that she carried in her simple dress sleeve a letter that would change the course of that entire session, a letter that D. Isabel de Castro had written but never sent, and that truth itself had put in her hands. The marble hall vibrated with the tension of hundreds of contained breaths when Archbishop Di Diogo rose to begin the extraordinary session. His voice resonated through the high vaults like solemn thunder. "We are gathered to hear D. Isabel de Castro's allegations regarding the validity of the royal marriage, and so that truth may be established before God and men." D. Isabel rose with the grace of one who had been born for moments like that. She wore an emerald-green silk dress that enhanced her blue eyes, and her blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate construction of braids and pearls that proclaimed her nobility with every movement. When she spoke, her voice carried the educated musicality of generations of aristocratic lineage. "Most excellent gentlemen," she began, her words flowing like water over polished stones, "I come before you to confess an error that not only harmed my honor, but put at risk the legitimacy of the Portuguese crown." The murmur that ran through the hall was silenced by a gesture from the Queen Mother, but Maria de los Dolores could feel expectation growing like high tide. "On the morning of my marriage to His Highness, Prince D. João de Avis, I was taken by a moment of weakness and fear that led me to abandon my duties," continued D. Isabel, each word carefully chosen for maximum dramatic impact. "I recognized that this attitude was unworthy of my position and harmful to the kingdom's interests." She made a calculated pause, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the assembly like golden dust. "But when I returned, I discovered that a substitute had taken my place at the altar. An orphaned maid, without noble birth or appropriate education to occupy Portugal's throne. Her eyes met those of Maria de los Dolores, and in them there was not cruelty, but a cold determination like the approaching winter. I come to request that this mistake be corrected, and that I be restored to the position that corresponds to me by right of birth and royal promise." The silence that followed was so dense it seemed possible to touch it. Maria de los Dolores remained motionless in her chair, observing D. Isabel with a serenity that contrasted with the agitation she could feel reverberating through the assembly. It was as if she were witnessing the unfolding of a story whose ending she knew, although the other characters still struggled against the inevitable. It was then that she rose, and her movement was so natural and unpretentious that for a moment it seemed she was simply preparing to leave the hall discreetly. But instead, she walked to the center of the space between the chairs, where her simple figure dramatically contrasted with the opulence of the noble outfits around her. "Most excellent gentlemen," she said, her clear and firm voice resonating through the ancient stones, "before any decision is made, I would like to present a document that may clarify D. Isabel de Castro's true intentions." A murmur of surprise ran through the hall. From inside her simple dress sleeve, Maria withdrew a folded letter, sealed with the Castro seal. It was evident it had been opened and read, but the original seal remained intact enough to identify its origin. "This letter," said Maria, her voice gaining strength with each word, "was found among the belongings that D. Isabel left behind when she fled. In it, she not only assumes total responsibility for her flight, but declares her intention to never return to fulfill a union she considered golden prison of a soul born to fly free." D. Isabel's face visibly paled, and Maria could see in her eyes the exact moment when she recognized the words she had written on a night of anguish, shortly after her flight. It was a second letter, more intimate and revealing than the one left on the pillow, and which had been forgotten among books and personal objects. "May I read the exact words?" asked Maria, and when the Archbishop nodded, her voice gained a solemnity that transformed the hall into a cathedral of revealed truths. "I depart because I understood that I will never be able to love a man I didn't choose, nor be mother to children generated from duty and not from passion. May they find for João de Avis a woman who can love him as he deserves, for I am not that woman and never will be." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing through the tall windows. D. Isabel de Castro remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the marble floor, as if she could find there the words she had lost. It was Prince de Jouem who broke the silence, rising with a dignity that radiated natural authority. "The letter speaks for itself," he said, his voice carrying a finality that resonated through the vaults. D. Isabel de Castro abandoned not only a marriage, but expressly rejected any possibility of love or duty toward this kingdom. Maria de los Dolores, on the other hand, accepted a responsibility she didn't choose and has honored it with dignity. He walked until he stood beside Maria, and when he took her hand, the gesture was so natural it seemed it had always been destined to happen. "More than that," he continued, "she conquered something that no political arrangement could ever guarantee. She conquered my heart and my respect. And a kingdom governed by the heart will always be stronger than a kingdom governed only by blood." Archbishop de Diogo rose solemnly. "Before the evidence presented and the declarations made, I declare that the marriage between His Highness, Prince de João de Avis and Maria de los Dolores remains valid and indissoluble before God and men. But Maria de los Dolores' true victory wasn't in the Archbishop's official declaration. It was in the gaze of the man beside her, who had chosen to defend her not out of political duty, but for something much more powerful and lasting. 3 days after the audience in the Marble Hall, D. Isabel de Castro asked to meet with Maria de los Dolores in the palace gardens. There was something deeply symbolic in the choice of place. Among the rose bushes that slept under winter's mantle, 2 women who had shared an impossible destiny would finally face each other without masks or audiences. Maria arrived first, wrapped in a dark blue wool cloak that protected her from December's cold wind. The garden was silent, painted by winter's pale tones, and only the sound of the central fountain broke the quietude that seemed to envelop the entire world. When Isabel emerged among the cypresses, walking with hesitant steps, Maria understood that this was no longer the haughty woman who had challenged the court 3 days before. "You came," said D. Isabel, and her voice carried a simplicity that made her seem younger, more human. She wore a simple brown wool dress without the ornaments she used to wear, as if she had decided to strip herself of all pretensions along with the jewels. "I always come when I'm called," responded Maria, and there was no bitterness in her words, only the serene observation of an entire life built on obedience. They sat on a stone bench that stood under a pergola covered by sleeping vines. The wind moved the dry leaves across the ground, creating a whispered symphony that served as soundtrack for conversations that transcended the common. "The letter you presented," began D. Isabel, but the words seemed too heavy for her lips. "It was yours. I found it among the books you left in your chamber's library," said Maria, her honesty cutting through any possibility of misunderstanding. "I wasn't looking for it. It simply appeared when I needed to understand why you had returned." D. Isabel looked at her hands intertwined in her lap, hands that had never known hard work, but that seemed to carry now the weight of choices she couldn't undo. "I wrote it on a night when I cried so much, I thought there wouldn't be more tears in the entire world," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was more honest than the letter I left on the pillow. In it, I wished that João would find a woman who could truly love him." "And why did you return then?" Maria's question was genuine, devoid of accusation or triumph. "Because I discovered that the freedom I so desired was also a prison of solitude and regret." D. Isabel raised her eyes to meet Maria's, and in them there was a vulnerability that nobility had never managed to completely hide. "And because I realized I had been a coward, I fled without giving João a chance, without giving myself a chance. But when I returned and saw you together, I understood something that my letter had prophesied without my knowing." D. Isabel smiled for the first time since sitting down, a sad but genuine smile. "I saw how he looks at you, Maria, and I saw how you look back at him. There's something between you that would never exist between us, no matter how much we tried." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 women who finally understood they weren't enemies, just 2 people who had been placed on opposite sides of a situation neither had created. "I'm going to retire to the convent of Our Lady of Graces," said D. Isabel finally. "Not by imposition or exile, but by my own choice. Perhaps there I'll find the peace I never managed to find at court. And if you change your mind, I won't change it." The certainty in D. Isabel's voice was absolute. For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I want to do, and I want you to be happy, Maria de los Dolores. I want you to love João as he deserves to be loved, and for him to love you as I know he already does." When they rose from the bench, the two women embraced briefly. It wasn't an embrace of deep friendship, but of mutual recognition and respect for different paths that led to the same place, acceptance of what life had reserved for each one. "There's one more thing," said D. Isabel before departing. "Doña Filipa de Meneses won't easily give up her intrigues. She always nurtured dreams of influencing the throne through me. Be careful with her." Maria de los Dolores nodded in understanding, but felt no fear. She had faced greater storms and survived. And now, for the first time since wearing that wedding dress on a September morning, she felt she had not only the right to be where she was, but the heart to face whatever the future might bring. When Isabel disappeared among the cypresses, walking toward the palace to make preparations for her departure, Maria remained in the garden for a few more minutes. The wind whispered among the sleeping trees, and she could swear it carried with it the perfume of roses that would still bloom in the following spring. The royal chapel had never housed a ceremony so intimate and, paradoxically, so grandiose in its meaning. Unlike the previous marriage, performed amid pomp and diplomatic necessity, this renewal of vows took place on a January morning, when winter sun filtered through the stained glass windows like golden blessing over barely a dozen people. Maria de los Dolores didn't wear silk imported from Florence or pearls that told stories of ancestral queens. She had chosen a simple white wool dress, embroidered by her own hands with gold threads that drew roses and thorns, symbol of a love that had bloomed amid adversities. Her hair fell loose over her shoulders, held only by a blue ribbon that had been her mother's, the only inheritance she kept from life before the convent. Prince Di João awaited her at the altar, but this time there wasn't the weight of political obligation on his shoulders. He wore a simple blue coat, without the golden embroidery of the first ceremony. And when Maria walked toward him, his eyes met hers, with an intensity that made the small group of witnesses understand they were witnessing something rare, a marriage based on love. The Queen Mother observed from the first row, and on her face there was an approval that transcended mere political satisfaction. She had learned to respect Maria de los Dolores not only as daughter-in-law, but as the woman who had returned the shine to her son's eyes. Archbishop D. Diogo smiled openly, happy to perform a ceremony where the sacrament truly reflected the union of two souls. "Today," said the Archbishop when the newlyweds positioned themselves before him, "we celebrate not only the renewal of vows, but the recognition that true love can be born from the most improbable circumstances and flourish in the most arid soils." João took Maria's hands, and when he spoke, his words resonated through the chapel like a declaration that went far beyond traditional vows. "Maria," he said, his voice charged with an emotion that made the candles tremble, "when I met you, you were dressed as another man's bride, but today I understand that destiny brought you to me not as someone's substitute, but as the woman I was destined to love. I promise you not only fidelity and protection, but respect for your strength, admiration for your dignity, and the love that grows every day that passes." Maria felt tears burn her eyes, but when she responded, her voice came out firm and clear, charged with a certainty that had taken months to build. "João," she said, and by using only his name without titles or formalities, she was declaring that she spoke not with a prince, but with the man she had learned to love. "When they brought me to this palace, I was only an orphaned maid without choices. But you taught me that love is the only true nobility, and that a brave heart is worth more than any title. I promise you not only obedience but partnership, not only respect, but a love I choose to renew every morning." The kiss that sealed those vows wasn't the formal fulfillment of a ritual. It was the celebration of two people who had found in each other not only a spouse but a home. When they left the chapel, they found the palace courtyards full of common people, merchants, artisans, maids, guards, who had come to celebrate their princess's marriage. Because Maria de los Dolores had become, without realizing it, a symbol of hope for all those who hadn't been born in golden cradles, but dreamed of better lives. Flowers rained on them as they walked through the gardens, and Maria understood that those weren't just falling petals. They were the blessings of a people who had found in her story proof that fairy tales could happen even in real life. That night, in the chambers they now truly shared, João and Maria sat by the window that faced the gardens where everything had begun. She embroidered a new piece, a map of Portugal ornamented with roses, while he read state documents. But from time to time their hands met on the table, and in those moments both knew they had discovered something more precious than any royal treasure. They had discovered that true love doesn't need explanations or justifications. It only needs courage to exist. And in the palace corridors, the maids whispered a new version of the story, not that of an impostor who had deceived a kingdom, but that of a kingdom that had learned that the heart is worth more than blood, and that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised in the simplest forms. 6 months had passed since the renewal of vows, and the royal palace breathed a peace it hadn't known for a long time. The spring of 1548 had brought with it not only the awakening of flowers in the gardens, but a profound transformation in how the kingdom saw itself. Maria de los Dolores' story had spread far beyond the palace walls, becoming a living legend that mothers told daughters and that troubadours sang in Lisbon's taverns. Maria had established a routine that reflected both her new position and her humble past. 3 times a week, she travelled to the convent of Our Lady of Mercy, where she had established classes for orphaned girls like she had been. She taught them not only to read and write, but to embroider, and more importantly, to believe that their destinies weren't defined by the circumstances of their births. "How your hands can create beauty regardless of where they were born," she would say to the girls who gathered in the convent courtyard. Their attentive little faces turned toward that princess who spoke their language because she had walked their paths. "And your hearts can dream of any height, as long as you're brave enough to fly." Sister Caterina, who had been the one to first take her from the convent to the palace on that morning that changed everything, observed the classes with tears of pride. "She became exactly what she always was," she would say to the other nuns, "a woman of faith who found her mission." In the palace, Maria had conquered not only the courtiers' respect, but something rarer, their genuine affection. Her ability to remember the servants' names, to ask about their families, to treat each person as a human being worthy of attention, had created a devotion that transcended mere hierarchical obedience. Doña Filipa de Meneses had departed to her lands in the north of the country shortly after the failure of her intrigues. Before departing, she requested an audience with Maria in a last attempt to understand how an orphaned maid had managed not only to remain on the throne, but to conquer the prince's true love. "I don't understand," she had said, her voice charged with genuine perplexity. "I have noble blood, refined education, political connections, and I'm only someone who learned that love isn't conquered. It's offered," Maria had responded, without malice or triumph. "And that true nobility isn't in the blood, but in how we treat those who can offer us nothing in return." It was on one of those spring afternoons, when she was returning from the convent with hands still perfumed by the ink she used to teach the girls to write, that Maria found João waiting for her in the gardens. He was sitting on the same bench where they had met months before, but this time there was something different in his posture, a happiness that radiated like its own light. "I have news," he said when she approached, rising to take her hands. "News that will change our lives once more." Maria felt her heart accelerate, but not from fear, from expectation. She had learned that not all changes were storms, some were springs. "My father the king has improved considerably," said João, and his joy was so intense it seemed to illuminate the entire garden. "The doctors believe he'll recover completely, and he asked to meet you, not as princess consort, but as the woman who returned happiness to his son." Maria de los Dolores felt tears burn her eyes. During all those months, she had lived knowing the king was too ill to participate in her life, that perhaps she would never meet him. The idea of finally meeting the man who had raised the man she had learned to love filled her with an emotion she didn't know how to name. "There's more," continued João, taking her by the arms with a delicacy that made her feel precious, like rare crystal. "He wants to hold an official coronation ceremony, not just as renewal of vows, but as public recognition that you are truly the Princess of Portugal, chosen not by political convenience, but by your own merit." "João," whispered Maria, and for the first time since arriving at the palace, she allowed herself to cry tears that weren't of pain or fear, but of a gratitude so deep it seemed to come from the roots of her soul. "More than that," he said, drying her tears with fingers that knew every line of her face. "He wants you to officially establish your school, a royal school for orphaned girls, with the crown's full support. Your school, Maria. Your dream made reality." In that moment, among the rose bushes that had witnessed so many crucial moments of her journey, Maria de los Dolores understood she had found not only a place in the world, but her purpose in it. It was as if all the pains of her childhood, all the tears of the convent, all the fears of the first days in the palace had been planted like seeds that finally bloomed into something beautiful. But there was still a secret she kept, a secret she had discovered only the previous week, and that would transform everything once more. A secret she carried in her womb like a promise of a future that neither she nor João yet knew existed. The news that Maria de los Dolores carried as a secret treasure was revealed on a May night, when the palace gardens exhaled the perfume of 1,000 flowers and the full moon painted the marbles with silver light. They were in their chambers, she embroidering another piece for the school that would soon be officially established, he reviewing plans for the coronation ceremony that would take place the following month. "João," she said, and there was something in her voice that made him raise his eyes from the documents and concentrate all his attention on her. "I need to tell you something that will change our plans and our future." He placed the papers on the table and walked to her, sitting on the upholstered bench where Maria embroidered. The candlelight danced on her face, revealing a deep serenity mixed with a joy that seemed to radiate from within. "I'm expecting your child," she said simply, and the words fell upon the night's silence like dewdrops on rose petals. João remained motionless for a moment, as if he needed to allow the news to penetrate every fiber of his being. Then, slowly, he extended his hand to touch Maria's belly, where a new life grew like a promise of the future. "A child," he repeated, and his voice carried a reverence that transformed those two words into a prayer. "Our child. A child who will carry royal blood and a common people's heart," said Maria, covering his hand with hers. "A child who will learn that true nobility isn't in the cradle where one is born, but in the choices one makes." That night, embraced in the bed that had witnessed the transformation of a forced marriage into a union of love, both dreamed of the future that unfolded before them like a map of infinite possibilities. The official coronation ceremony took place on a June day that seemed to have been painted by the angels themselves. The same marble hall that had witnessed Maria's trial now transformed into the theatre of her glorification. But this time, she wasn't just a substitute or an impostor who had turned out well. She was Maria de los Dolores de Avis, Princess of Portugal, by her own right, recognized not only by the royal blood that ran in her husband's veins, but by the royal heart that beat in her own chest. King D. Manuel, finally recovered, placed on her head not the pearl tiara she had worn in the forced marriage, but a new crown, forged especially for her with Portuguese gold and stones, representing all the kingdom's provinces. It was a crown that didn't carry the weight of tradition, but the promise of the future. "Maria de los Dolores de Avis," said the king with a voice that resonated through the vaults like divine proclamation, "for your courage, your dignity, and your love for this kingdom, I declare you true Princess of Portugal, mother of future princes, and example for all women who dream that merit can triumph over birth." When the ceremony ended and Lisbon's bells announced to the world that Portugal had a new princess, Maria and João walked through the palace gardens where everything had begun. The child they expected was still only a promise whispered by the future, but already transformed everything around them. "Do you know what will be the first decree I'll sign when I become king?" asked João, stopping by the fountain where water sang its eternal song. "What?" asked Maria, though she suspected the answer. "That any orphaned child in the kingdom will have the right to free education, regardless of their origin. And that nobility will be measured not by blood, but by actions." He smiled at her with that smile she had learned to love more than any treasure. "A kingdom where stories like ours are possible not only by chance, but by right." Maria de los Dolores lightly touched the belly where her child grew, imagining the world it would find at birth, a world where an orphaned maid could become a princess, where love could triumph over convenience, where the heart was worth more than blood. "And our school?" she asked. "Our school will be the first step," said João, taking her in his arms as he had done so many times in the perfumed gardens. The first step toward a Portugal where every child can dream as high as the sky. Years later, when Maria de los Dolores de Avis would be remembered not only as the maid who became a princess, but as the queen who revolutionized a kingdom through love and education. People would say her story proved that fairy tales could happen in real life. But Maria knew it hadn't been a fairy tale. It had been something much more powerful. It had been proof that when the heart is brave enough to love and the soul is strong enough to persevere, even destinies written in the stars can be rewritten by human hands. And so among embroideries that told stories of roses and thorns, among classes where orphaned girls learned they could dream of crowns, among embraces that proved true love can be born from the most improbable circumstances, Maria de los Dolores found not only a place in the world, but the certainty that she had transformed the world into a better place.